second day of the Asia-Pacific Conference on the Resilience of Democracy. So today we have a very interesting panel discussion, but before we get to that, a few introductory remarks by Lena Rikila-Tamang from International IDEA.
Good morning everyone. Not really introductory remarks, rather Dr. Qureshi and I were discussing that I should say a few words of someone we are missing here from this conference and from this panel. Dr. Surin Pitsuwan was the chair of International IDEA Board of Advisors and very unexpectedly passed away on 30th November. Some of you knew him very well, like Dr. Rubal, who is with us here today from Thailand. Some of you maybe less. But Dr. Pitsuwan played a very key role in the political development of his own country, Thailand, as an MP, member of parliament, as a minister, and also as in this region as a Secretary General for the ASEAN, and was known worldwide. I believe Dr. Surin was really a true champion for democracy, and we will all miss him very much. And as he himself once described himself, he's a Muslim Malay child from dusty southern Thailand. I would like to propose we take one brief moment of silence remembering Dr. Surin Pitsuwan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena. So we will now kick off the program, which is a panel on 21st century challenges to democracy. Could I please ask the panelists to take the stage? Right now, we will have Honorable Roina Guanzon, Commissioner of Elections from the Philippines, Dr. Paikesote Saravanamuttu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, Leompo Thakur Singh Paudel, former Minister of Education from Bhutan, and we also have the Executive Director of Perludem from Indonesia, Ms. Titi Anggreni. And the panel will be moderated by Dr. Asanga Valikala, the Director of the Center for Constitutional Studies.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Very good morning to you. We have an extremely interesting panel to start off with this morning, the deliberations that you're continuing from yesterday on the 21st century challenges to democracy. I understand that you have dealt with a great deal of issues yesterday, both in the general sessions as well as in the labs. And I look forward very much to hearing from our extremely interesting panel, which has a mixed set of case studies, really. That is Philippines, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Indonesia. There is a mixed bag here in terms of the relative levels of political and constitutional development. Some have been very old, procedural democracies, certainly, but with certain problems of their own. Others are much more new, democratizing countries. These are also countries of very rich societal pluralism, which has posed in each of them some very interesting, to put it that way, challenges to the democratic form of government. So I don't wish to say anything more. We will follow the order that is there in the agenda, starting with Philippines. What I will intend to do is to try and give the panelists each about 10 minutes or slightly less, if you can manage, so that we can have more time for discussion. To kick off then, Commissioner Guanzon.
Good morning. The Philippines ratified the UN CEDAW in 1981. That's around 36 years ago. 36 years ago, since then, the CEDAW has been the basis for some very important legislations on women's rights. Among them, the Women and Nation Building Act, which provides a requirement that at least 5% of the total budget of all national and local agencies must be spent for gender and development. And that has a large impact on women's political participation, especially recently in the last 10 years. Also, the Magna Carta of Women, the Anti-Violence Against Women Act, the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act, the last two or last three that I mentioned have the state policy on state obligations to comply with our commitment with the CEDAW. So, if you see the number of women in politics or elected office since then, it has not really increased dramatically. But on the average before 2010, we were just ranging in the average of 10 to 12% women in elected office. And it has improved since 2010. At present, there are about 25% women senators, 6 out of 24, and our representatives about 86 out of 292, or almost 30%. And so we're seeing recently a dramatic increase in the House of Representatives from the average of 10% so to now 30%. And why is that happening? Well, it's happening because the families or political dynasties are fielding their women candidates after the men finish their 3 terms. We have a 3-term limit rule in the Philippines. And so, you know, we don't have a law on political dynasties except in the barrio or village elections, where relatives of the incumbent officials are not allowed to run for office. But as we can see with this trend now, that political dynasties is not entirely a bad thing for Filipino women politicians today. When we look at the gender gap index, the Philippines looks popular because in Asia, it still ranks #1 among the Asian countries. But it decreased from 7th in the gender gap index all over the world to number 10 in 2016, last year. And the reason is that we have a wider gap, gender gap in the wage sector now. Also, although our education level rated very high, our political participation is rated quite low, at 0.4 points out of a perfect score of 1.0. And this is really because on the average, in the village, from the village level to the national level, we only have 25%, 20 to 25% women are elected into office. And we suffer the same barriers, which are what you call the same challenges for most Asian or ASEAN countries. And these are, as you know, obstacles are culture, lack of money for campaign funds, low level of confidence of women to be political, to be candidates for office, and political parties do not commit to gender equality. Although we're talking about, the COMELEC of the Philippines is talking about gender quotas. We have started talking about it since last year. The political parties listen, but have not taken any initiative. We hope that there will be a voluntariness on their part in the succeeding elections, because we know that having a law on gender quota is really a dream, just a dream in the next maybe 5 years. But with the high number of women now in Congress in the Philippines, compared to 10 years ago, there is still reason to hope that they will start talking about ways or laws to increase the number of women in our elected offices. We also found out through a study in COMELEC that aside from these obstacles, women voters are not voting for women. So we have almost 52% women voters out of 56 million voters, and only 25% women are in office because women are not running. There are less women running for office in the first place. So there's definitely less women who will win and be in office. But the challenge really is how to not only on the demand side, but also the supply side, that the women voters should be encouraged to understand why they should be voting for women candidates who are equally qualified. So we're doing a lot of projects and activities in the COMELEC Gender and Development Executive Committee nationwide. And some of these are recent. Of course, we're talking about the last 2 years. Among them, we have the Women in Election seminars where we teach the women candidates, how to fill up their candidacy forms, how to do the statement of contribution reporting after the elections. And we have a nationwide educational program for young people because our youth elections are also happening in May 2018 together with the village elections. So nationwide we're also doing Know Your Elections Better with the gender committee. And so we're encouraging more girls to attend the seminar, and then for more girls to know how why elections are important, why democracy is important, why they should participate. Because we're looking at a very young voting population in the Philippines. I think about more than 60% of our voters are below 40 years old. And if you look at the demographics and if you look at the population increase, we have like 1.5 million baby Filipinos born every year. So if you have 1.5 million baby Filipinos born every year, you're looking at the next 15 years, they're going to start voting for their youth leaders in the local government council. So we really have to start thinking about, not just our obstacles now, but what kind of citizens are we going to have in the next 15 years? How are they going to run for office? And how are women going to be able to have access to political office? How are women going to be voting for women and men candidates? So these are really questions that we would like to explore. And hopefully we can have a study by next year together with our Population Commission and other agencies. And of course we would like to learn from all of you. So, see, why social media is so important? It's because young people really use it every day. They use it everywhere, including, Googling how to put on makeup, on YouTube. So this is a tool that I think appeals a lot to our young people. So we're using that also as a strategy to connect with our voters now, the women especially, and the girls in schools. So where are we now after SIDO? In terms of gender equality in politics, not much. I mean, we're better off than 30% in the House of Representatives. 30% women is a lot compared to, let's say, 10, 20 years ago, which is like less than 10%. Are we happy about it? Sure. I mean, is that going to be a permanent thing? Is that a trend? Probably. But is that going to get better? I'm not sure, because it can slide down to less than 20% again, depending on, again, the political opportunities that are there for the families that are in political power. So I think that these challenges are very similar to ASEAN countries, and especially that when elections are very expensive, and we can't give women equal access to it because they're expensive. It's going to take the Philippines, given no interventions, it's going to take, we studied that, it's going to take a century, 100 years to get an equal number of men and women in our Congress, or at least in the House of Representatives, if there are no interventions, such as the gender quota. So we're really looking forward to learning how to achieve a level of gender equality in politics, or at least have some kind of a number or a mass, achieve a critical mass for women to make a difference in political life.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for very wide-ranging, in a fairly short time, a number of issues that you raised. I'm sure that there are lots of parallels across Asia-Pacific for a number of the issues that you raised, including the fact that you can set international standards for these things, but when it meets obstacles of local culture and practices and all the rest of it, the kinds of challenges that you face in advancing international standards with regard to the content of democracy. Sarah.
Yeah. As most people know, in January 2015 in this country, there was an unprecedented event which had hitherto been considered almost impossible. Probably the broadest coalition of political forces in this country got together and defeated an incumbent president who was seen as extremely strong, defeated that incumbent president who was trying to get an unprecedented third term in office as executive president of this country. Now, I think what is significant about that was that the two major political parties of this country, for the first time in its history, got together voluntarily to form a government. And the platform that it won that election on was a platform largely of what is now known as good governance in the Sri Lankan context, abolition of the executive presidency, a political constitutional settlement of the national question, a new electoral system, right to information legislation. So very much of a liberal democratic agenda of reform. 3 years later, unfortunately, there is a sense of palpable disappointment that the reform agenda, although achieved in some measure, has certainly not been achieved in a measure that meets public satisfaction and public requirement. Support is therefore hemorrhaging. And as a consequence, I think the first point I want to make is in terms of the whole challenge of democracy in the 21st century, is that the performance in government of politicians who promise so much and deliver much less has a long-term deleterious impact on the institutions and processes, the institutions in particular of liberal democracy. And in this respect, I want to pinpoint the whole question of political parties. In Sri Lanka, I don't think I'm exaggerating if I say that public opinion in respect of political parties is extremely low. There is the consideration of political parties as being associations for corruption and money-making, deal-making. And despite political rhetoric with regard to ideology, that at the end of the day, it is a common culture that infuses these associations, and they are no different when it comes to the question of government and power. Now, in that election in 2015, I suppose the buzzword was accountability. In the north and east of the country, the direct theaters of war, as it were, The issue of accountability was in respect of human rights violations, the allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc., and the whole question of reconciliation, of demonstrable substantive steps taken to achieve that reconciliation and national unity. In the rest of the country, accountability was very simply accountability in respect of corruption, in respect of financial corruption. And as soon as the new government came into office, we were fed on a daily diet of how much they had looted. And as we speak today, not much has happened in terms of remedial measures, and certainly with regard to convictions as far as corruption is concerned. So this leads to a great deal of public cynicism, and I think one of the challenges that we face, therefore, is, well, it is a democratic deficit, but it's also a trust deficit as to whether we are going to get the same number of people who came out to vote in 2015 voting again. Already we know that that category of people between the ages of 20 to 40, and indeed first-time voters, registration has fallen. That is already a recorded fact. Indeed, that category of people between the ages of 20 to 40 did get proactively involved in the campaigns of 2015, particularly as far as social media was concerned, and now are hemorrhaging in terms of support for the government on a daily basis. And that also then points to another factor that I would like to highlight, and that is that it is that particular constituency which is going to be in positions of power and authority over the next 2 to 3 decades or so that needs to be brought back into the democratic mainstream and their faith in democratic institutions and processes reinstated. That, I think, is a major challenge. Social media is an instrument, but so far it has been proved to be an instrument of frustration and anger, of a need for a quick fix and quick answers, rather than as a medium through which messages, positive messages, can be disseminated. But that brings me to another question as well, and that is that a challenge, therefore, is also the challenge of command control communication. One of the big problems that we have is that there isn't an ongoing conversation between government ostensibly embarked on reform, constitutional reform, transitional justice, with the population at large. Why are we doing what we are doing? Why is it that we can't do more? Why is it that we need to do these things? And what is the connection between them? Why do we feel that we need to sequence constitutional reform and transitional justice? Why can't the two go together? What are the implications of constitutional reform for an economy and the stated objective of being a hub of the Indian Ocean? Now, there are longer-term questions, I think, which one needs to look at when one thinks of challenges. One of the first things that comes to mind is that in terms of institutions and processes of liberal democracy in particular, political parties are an issue. The Prime Minister has spoken about the need to, after we have a new electoral system of a multi-member proportional representation system, of looking at campaign finance. But I think just looking at campaign finance alone is not going to be enough. Although now that we have right to information legislation, we might be able to get more information out into the public realm with regard to it. We do know our political parties are run as local fiefdoms. There is no intra-party democracy whatsoever. And it does sort of, beg the question of how can organizations which have no experience and no commitment towards internal democracy, how on earth are they going to practice governance once in government? So I think that is an area that needs to be looked at. A second area, and this is a much longer term question, is that our education system does not educate our children to be citizens of a democratic society. We need to look at building up that sense of rights and entitlement, but also that question of duties and responsibilities, what it entails. So I think that is something that into the long term we need to be able to look at. That also has a key impact with regard to reconciliation and the whole question of national unity, of recognizing that this is a tremendously diverse and plural society, and that the architecture of governance at the end of the day needs to be able to reflect that. We have laws in Sri Lanka. Indeed, we need more legal reform. But I think the overarching emphasis needs now also to be on the culture that animates those laws, animates those institutions and processes, so that they will function as near as possible to how they are intended to function. We have a big problem, I think, with regard to the whole question of political culture, which laws alone cannot answer.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that overview of the reforms process that is not yet officially dead in this country, but seems for all intents and purposes to be so after a very promising regime change, democratic regime change in 2015. You spoke about a lot of extremely important matters, the role of political parties, of youth engagement and so on. But for me, I suppose the two most important points of general application that you made on the basis of the Sri Lankan experience was the underscoring of the centrality of the relationship between institutions and culture. We do legal reforms in order to reform institutions relatively better than we do in terms of the improvements and strengthening of the animating culture of politics that makes all the difference in terms of the lived experience of democracy. And I think that is a general lesson that is very valuable to us across the Asia Pacific. And the second point that you made also was about the relationship between promise and performance. Because the more we promise and the less we deliver, and political parties are hugely responsible for this, you end up eroding public confidence in not only the democratic and political process, but engendering possibly public cynicism and disengagement, and that cannot be a good thing. Finally, though, you mentioned from the Sri Lankan perspective the different perceptions of the term accountability as between North and South, and in that you also underscored the importance of some of these things, how they pan out in a plural society. But much more valuable, I suppose, was the general point, nonetheless, you made about the fundamental value of accountability in a democracy. Unless the idea of accountability is something that animates the population as a whole in a democracy, the trust that is necessary in terms of a functioning political culture and political community, or nation, if you will, cannot be constructed, and that then poses all sorts of problems for the implementation of a truly democratic political culture. We now move to Bhutan. Thakur, I understand you want to speak from the lectern for a bit.
First of all, let's say what a great delight it is for all of us to be first invited and welcomed so warmly to the capital of a country that the Italian traveler Marco Polo once described as the most beautiful city, most beautiful country on earth. And certainly, as I was sitting and listening to the conversation on democracy, its resilience, and the threats to it, in the first panel yesterday, I felt as though I was such a naive person, despite the fact that I've been through the mill, having participated in the first democratically elected government, as well as observing very closely the processes that have evolved in the country over the last 9 years now. I know that the participants, delegates gathered here, belong to systems that have been established over a long period of time and done very well. I see that it's also time that we looked at some of the deeper issues of democracy, the challenges that it's facing. From that point of view, I feel that Bhutan presents some striking exceptions to this norm. In the first place, the exception that I recall is the fact that His Majesty the Third King, the Gyalpo Jigme Dorje Wangchuk, having set up the National Assembly as early as 1953, decided that if 2/3 of the members of the National Assembly decided that they had no confidence in the king, he would abdicate in favor of the next in line of succession. The second very important exception that I've noticed is when His Majesty the Fourth King, the Gyalpo Jigme Wangchuk, announced that Bhutan ought to follow a path of development that would be an exception to the conventional model of development, otherwise called GDP, and called that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. I thought that was a striking example of an exception indeed. And come 2005, in the Tashi Declaration, His Majesty said that the rule of many would be better than the rule of one, and that in 2008 there would be national elections, and that Bhutan would go democratic. Perhaps this is the first time in monarchical traditions in the world that monarchy paved the way for democracy. And we never realized that unlike the examples that we saw yesterday, while leaders manipulate processes and systems and instruments to navigate their way to a continuation of their power, here was a king who was actually preparing people for a democratic dispensation. And now we have been through the second round of elections. The third one is just around the corner. But we believe that Bhutan's democracy has been also an exception. Another exception to the rule has been that when His Majesty announced that Bhutan would go democratic, the people of Bhutan actually went out of their way to plead to the king not to make any change, because at that point in time, His Majesty the Fourth King was at the peak of his fame, deeply loved and highly revered by his people. So these are some of the exceptions to the way democracy has come to Bhutan. And we believe that while democracy is highly dramatic, it's exciting and also very dramatic, it also has its own vulnerabilities. That is why at this point in time, given the fact that we are young in this process, we would like to look at some of the fundamental issues that involve democracy. Because democracy has to understand its claims. Whose claims does democracy serve? If democracy is the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, elected leaders ought to understand that this is an extremely important claim that democracy has to serve. But yesterday we saw some examples where democracy does not serve the claims of the electorate. And over time, the irony of it all is that hope and frustration of hope, opportunities and frustration of those opportunities, optimism and despair, these seem to be the order of the day in many parts of the world. That is why it is important for us to be mindful of the fact that democracy ought to be a process and not an end. If democracy is an end in itself, it will go so far but no further. But if it's a process, a means to an end, and the end is to serve the people who elect leaders, then democracy could be a lot more sustainable and a lot more satisfying. Democracy ought to be able to cultivate faith and hope in the people. A society without hope cannot last for long. If democracy cannot educate the electorate, if it cannot educate the people, as Professor Sara was mentioning just now, then democracy will be soon a liability, where it can actually be an asset. Because this must be the most important project in any society at the moment, democracy. The most important enterprise that people undertake to govern themselves and to look to the future. But if a democracy does not serve the purpose for which so much of engagement of people at all levels happens, then it will soon be a liability. I believe that democracy is dependent upon a few important guarantors. And these guarantors often seem antithetical to democracy itself. The guarantors, I believe, are a sense of self-discipline. Not discipline so much imposed from outside, but discipline that an individual cultivates within himself or herself. Self-discipline. But many people in democracy believe that discipline is antithetical to democracy. A very important guarantor of democracy, I believe, is a sense of mutual respect. If I want my rights to be protected, I have to be able to respect the rights of others. So mutual respect is extremely important. And the third guarantor, I believe, is a sense of responsibility. In democracies, it is very common to see people handing over the responsibility of even their own governance to an elected government. But His Majesty our Fourth King again mentioned long ago that we should never allow our people to develop an orphan mentality, because orphan mentality makes people dependent, whereas democracy should make them independent and strong. So where do elected leaders approach the electorate? Do they approach the electorate at the level of their strength, or do they approach the electorate at the level of their weakness and vulnerability? Democracy by nature has got to be an invocation to the strength of the people. Is got to invoke the impulse to contentment, impulse to hope, impulse to faith. But democratically elected leaders are often prone to invoking the weakest point in the electorate, the most vulnerable point in the electorate. And to the extent that it happens, it becomes a negation of democracy and not democracy proper. That's why we believe that at the end of the day, it is important to educate the people, educate the electorate, not only for votes, but for citizenship, for the future, because the stakes are very high. That's why democracy is a process. It cannot be taken for granted. It needs to be cultivated on a day-to-day basis, generation after generation. In fact, this is how we believe democracy can work. And especially for Bhutan, as small as we are, both in terms of demography as well as geography, it's important to be conscious of what the stakes are. See, that's why at this point in time, it's so important for us to come here, to learn what you all have been doing, and to see as to how we might be able to navigate into the future of a democratic Bhutan. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for also cooperating with the time limit. Endlessly fascinating example of Bhutan as a young, democratizing country, which very often does things its own way. And I think from a comparative perspective, there is lots to learn. And for me, it was also again underscoring the point that Sarah probably made at the end about the notion of a democratic community as a political collective. We are all individuals members of a collective, and the basis on which, the fundamental basis on which that relationship of trust is based on the idea of accountability, not only between the institutions of government and the population that votes for it, but also as between each other. And this is where I think your emphasis on the idea of responsibility, of discipline, of mutual respect are fundamentally important. We are very often suspicious of some of these concepts in Asian democracies because of the implications of control and the traditions of authoritarianism that we have had. But nonetheless, I think it is very important to remember that a substantive conception of democracy cannot be built on rights and autonomy and individualism alone. It also involves individuals living in a social and collective context. And it is in that sense that individuals in a democracy also have those very important ideas of responsibility that you rightly, I think, identified. And thank you for that. So on to then our final presentation from Indonesia. Titi, could I invite you to say a few words? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I will focus on the panel's theme about the 21st century challenge to democracy. In the context of Indonesia, as an archipelago comprising approximately more than 17,000 islands, a unitary state with 34 provinces, over than 256 million populations, and more than 34 provinces with more than 190 million voters from the last elections, 2014 elections. So the magnitude of territory, population, ethnicities, and religious diversity is already a challenge for democracy, and also the modalities. After being ruled by Suharto's authoritarian New Order regime for over 3 decades, for more than 32 years, in 1998, Indonesia embarked for a new phase called reform era, or reformasi in Bahasa Indonesia, or in Indonesian language. It was envisaged to be the starting period of a democracy with open and liberal politics. Now Indonesia is the third largest democratic country in the world. We are the biggest one-day election in the world, with 190 million voters scattered in more than 500,000 polling stations. And the biggest Muslim democratic country, although it is not an Islamic state. Indonesia proves to the world that Islam and democracy can work hand on hand, and it is compatible each other. Now we elect our president and vice president, members of parliament, upper and lower parliament, members of regional parliament, regional head and vice head of village head directly. And back to the definition of democracy used by the international idea as popular control over decision makers and political equality of those who exercise that controls, especially in Indonesia democracy. Challenges we face now are the weakness of popular control and the unavailability of political equality. The weakening of popular control and the absence of political equality are mainly caused by political parties that should carry out democratic values in election and post-election competition through their parliamentary representatives, but they don't carry out those values. Lack of political will from political actors and undemocratic party management resulted in adequate legislation relating to democracy, weak of law enforcement, and poor public services. Those things that trigger the practice of political corruptions and transactional politics continue to occur in election and state governance in Indonesia. Consequently, there is a patron-client relation that prevents citizens from doing popular control, and members of parliaments cannot create rules that guarantee political equality. And in Indonesia, it's like a vicious circle. So, how to make democracy remain resilient in Indonesia? Because I'm from a civil society organization, in my opinion, a connected civil society movement and media oversight can also be a balancing power to neutralize public pessimism. A vibrant civil society and free media will always generate discourse to fill the public space with a critical view to arouse public awareness. The civil society participation index in Indonesia is relatively high, maybe the highest in the Southeast Asia. Our score is 0.82 out 1. So it's a promising situation in Indonesia. And how about the other modalities, social media? Indonesia now has over than 132 million internet users, out of population 256 million people. Currently, Indonesia has become the capital of social media. We have 126 million Facebook users, number 4 in the world. We have 50 million Twitter users, 3rd highest in the world. And we have 45 million Instagram users. So we are so familiar with the social media. The last survey conducted by CSIS Indonesia finds that 54.3% of millennials who are in the range of age 19 to 29 reads online media every day, while only 11.9% of the older generation does. And 81.7% millennials have Facebook account, and only 23.4% of the older generation has one. And about the question, the role of the social media. Social media plays a key role as the algorithm provides related content which are similar and not constraining or not balanced. Sometimes it trapping people in the echo chambers, especially in the post-truth era, where facts matter less than emotions in influencing decision or policy. And yes, it was true that in the experience of Indonesia, for example, in the last Jakarta gubernatorial elections, social media created acute polarization of politics and contributed to strengthen identity politics. But in my opinion, in the context of Indonesia as a large archipelago's country, the positive impact of social media on Indonesian democracy is greater than the bad impact, if it is used as a voter education instrument and it's used as effective liaison between people and policymakers. Policymakers can absorb grassroots voice and aspiration more easily and authentically amid the vastness of the region and the size of the populations. Hence, digital literacy should be an instrument performed consistently by all related stakeholders, and electoral management bodies can take lead on doing this effort. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you again. Extremely interesting case study in Indonesia, not only because of its very large size, but also its pluralism and territorial diversity, which makes it a very challenging kind of society for the sustainability of democracy. But I'm so happy to see, with all of the challenges that you do face, that nonetheless in the broad direction, how well it is going. Thank you for also highlighting once again, as you did, Commissioner, earlier, the role of social media. I think this is going to be something that is, it already is a matter of huge interest to both practitioners like yourselves as well as academics like me. We will have to increasingly think of social media as just as much as we generally talk about constitutional institutions. Because this is increasingly going to be the way in which citizens engage with politics and with the business of governing. If you might forgive me, I might just add a couple of two things from a Sri Lankan perspective that we are very interested, but don't look often enough to Indonesia. The first is their notion of and you reminded us that it was a hugely Muslim majority country, but not an Islamic state, and the foundational ways in which, largely frozen during the Suharto era, but nonetheless there's very interesting thinking going on in terms of the way that the whole idea of the Indonesian nation post-independence was constructed around the values of Pancasila, which has some resonance to us as well here in Sri Lanka. Not merely in a Buddhist sense, but also in a more broadly secular and modern sense. And finally, of course, you are also a great case study with huge significance for us here in Sri Lanka about how to do devolution within a unitary state. You have managed a negotiated settlement in Aceh, which has then been put into some form of constitutionally entrenched autonomy settlement. That is a less radical but nonetheless significant framework in the state of Papua. Those are all, I think, examples from which here in Sri Lanka, as we grapple with those issues in a country where society is ethnically and religiously plural, but nonetheless with a dominant religious majority. And in that context, that we have to make compromises with some sort of centralized authority in the form of a unitary state, but deal with the challenges from the periphery within that context. So I think I have spoken long enough. I'm opening the floor to questions. We have quite a bit of time. I hope there are as many questions as I have had from the 4 excellent presentations to kick off this morning. So I will take 3 questions at a time, if you can all make a note, and if you can, just in terms of housekeeping, if you could identify yourselves and then ask your question, and possibly if the question is not for the whole panel but for an individual, then please let us know who that is as well. Can we start here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel very much apprehensive listening to the panelists that democracy is on the decline because the political leaders elected through democracy are not working well. The inter-party democracy is eroding, and the people are suffering because they elect their leaders in a democratic process. So what we can do, what the countries around can do, how we can shape the politics, how we can shape democracy in a way that it should work as an instrument of taking care of people and taking care of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for really quite excellent and inspiring presentations. Sorry, my name is Ju Cheong. I'm from the law school at the University of Melbourne. I thought that Minister Leompo's point about democracy invoking the hope and strength of people was such a crucial insight. And it was such a crucial insight that sort of, perhaps I'll use as a jumping off point, because I think it highlights certain risks and tensions as we move forward, particularly in dealing with this big issue of political corruption. It's of course a very important campaign to be undertaking, but it seems to me if we take Mr. Leompo's insight very seriously, I think we can see at least 3 types of risks with this campaign against political corruption. First is that campaign inherently is quite negative or critical in its orientation. So for most part, a lot of the efforts in that space don't tend to actually advance a positive vision of democracy. It's really about abuse of power, which of course we need to be vigilant against. The second risk is this, is that those campaigns are often premised on the argument that corruption reduces trust in public institutions. But the risk is that those campaigns themselves might in fact fuel or foster distrust in political institutions, particularly in political parties. The third risk follows from the first 2, is that there are parallels with some of the points made in terms of campaigns against political corruptions with what we see as populism. So one key parallel is that really about, if you like, quite a hostile critical stance towards the political elite, in particular political parties and political leaders. So my question to the whole panel is this. How do we navigate? We of course need to go ahead in terms of this campaign against political corruption, but how do we navigate this risk that we don't end up actually undermining the foundations of democracy in the name of saving democracy?
Thank you. Mark Salter, a former IDEA staff member from a few years back. This is really a question to the whole panel, which isn't very helpful, I realize, in deciding who should answer it, but nonetheless, here it is. I think there's an understandable tendency when we're thinking about the state of democracy to think within the team. We're talking about the countries that are part of the great team of democracies. But there is this little matter of the non-team, the opposition, the outsiders, call them what you will. And to me, that seems an incredibly important issue in this region in particular. We have the, dare I say it, elephant in the room called China, which is not a democracy, doesn't pretend to be a democracy, and which, quite apart from its own internal arrangements, is proving quite an attractive model, both on the economic and political fronts, to many countries in the region. That's just one example. We can look across the world, whether it's Russia or Venezuela or Syria or you name it, of authoritarians of a more or less benign variety proving quite effective at governance, quite attractive to their populations and even attractive to neighbours. So my question to the panel would be, from your perspective, how is democracy doing in the region in terms of, frankly, outplaying the opposition, of proving itself a more credible, better at delivery, better at integrity, better at all the things that political institutions are supposed to deliver, than the opposition? And I mentioned authoritarians, but I think the populists of the variety we've perhaps been seeing growing in Europe, but also other parts of the world, with authoritarian tendencies possibly. That needs to be seriously considered. So interested to hear your views on the opposition. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, the first question with regard to the extent to which anti-corruption initiatives actually undermine democracy, because what they're doing is disseminating stories which may well lead to the cumulative impact, maybe to increase the mistrust. I suppose what we perhaps need to focus on is that when we do expose all of that we need to complement it with some good examples, some good stories, because it's not the case, I don't think, that in every single country that we're talking about, that it is corruption so rampant that there are instances in which, whether it be at a local government level or at a provincial level, where anti-corruption initiatives have actually worked, or where honest administration has led to very positive and constructive results in a very palpable way in terms of development, etc. Where you've had, I mean, you have the stories in where in village contexts, for example, where people have got together and made sure that money is spent as intended and corrupt administrators, etc., have been thrown out. So I think we need to complement the exposure of corruption and its corrosive effects on government governance and indeed economic development as a whole with the more positive and constructive stories as well. And it is a challenge. I mean, I think social media as a medium is much more conducive to the venting of anger and frustration. The positive stories, quite frankly, are not as sexy as far as social media is concerned. The second point, Mark's question in terms of how is democracy doing in comparison to the competitors, is a very good question, I think, because I've always believed that as far as representative democracy is concerned, its future rests on our shoulders in this region. And in particular, I want to stick my neck out and say that it rests in South Asia, because the other elephant in the room is India. In terms of the future, in terms of two systems of government and governance, in terms of how you deal with plurality, ethnicity, in terms of how you deal with prosperity at large and development, etc., here you have the two examples. Which one becomes more like the other is the question, I think, into the future. And in that respect, it would seem that at the present moment, notions of populism, etc., seem to be on the ascent, rather than the other way around. And this is why we come back to that whole question of civil society, and civil society in general, therefore having a tremendous responsibility in holding government to the values that are within that society, that are conducive to the tolerance, to the mutual respect, to what Margaret calls, the whole argument about civilized societies and decent societies, about institutions not humiliating citizens and citizens not humiliating each other. If one can show that that is the way to go, it may not be as quick and fast as the other one. And indeed, as far as I'm concerned, the verdict in terms of the quote-unquote Chinese experiment, the jury is still out, But absolutely, we are in a situation in which the other side seems a lot more attractive. And therefore, it is incumbent on those of us who believe that what we are doing is right, and that is what is relevant and appropriate for our societies, to redouble our efforts And to make liberal democracy, I think, to inject the sense of adventure and romance into liberal democracy for the future.
Thank you. Just to maybe address about two issues. The first one being decline in democracy. Whether we like it or not, democracy is here, and it's here to stay. And what we make of it, I think it depends upon what we do with this. Yesterday, I got this feeling that there is a pervasive sense of cynicism, negativity, and loss of faith in this institution of democracy. And all over the world, democracies arise on a very upbeat, euphoric note, and soon there seems to be a kind of frustration of that hope. It is so ironical and tragic. The human race is involved in this extremely big enterprise called democracy. The human of the species, the Homo sapiens, the most highly evolved of all beings engaged in this enterprise. And we might as well be able to construct a system that serves to elevate us, the humans, and our societies, and our nations, and the world. However, the fact is that there are challenges with democracy, challenges of our making, challenges of the making of our leaders in different parts of the world. However, I think there is still hope. So many people are working towards protecting the integrity of democracies, democratic institutions. And here, International IDEA, Democracy International Reporting, Center for Policy Alternatives, and kindred institutions all over the world. And people like you have been working very hard on this. So I feel there is hope. There are challenges. We have no illusions about the challenges. But I think there is hope. And this is the only world we have. And it is only right that we work hard to make it better. There are a lot of well-meaning people, people of goodwill, and I think it's important to mobilize those. And nobody is so incorrigible that they can't be changed. As an educator, as a teacher, I believe that I believe in hope, I believe in possibility. There are challenges, we have no illusions about these, but I think still there's light at the end of the tunnel, if you like it. The last point that I heard was integrity. It is so critical. I think it is at the fundamental basis of democracy. Integrity at all levels. Integrity at the level of policy making. Integrity at the level of formulation of laws and acts that govern not only elections, but also overall governance of the countries. Integrity at the level of individual candidates. Integrity at the level of the electorate. Who do I elect? Who should be my leader? Is my leader going to serve the larger interest of the community and not his own or her own interests? And at the integrity at the level of conducting the elections themselves, how strong and how respectable and how honorable are the institutions that conduct the elections at all levels. Integrity of the election conducting bodies, integrity at the level of the participants in elections, participants in democracy. And after the government is formed, what is the level of integrity that the public can see? If the people see that there is a frustration of the hope, that they lose faith, I feel that it is extremely unfair, not only to the electorate, but to the system at large. So integrity should pervade all levels of the operation of democracy in elections, as indeed the society. Thank you.
That really felt good. Thank you. Well, corruption is always an issue in every election, in the Philippines, in Indonesia. And are people really voting on the basis of that issue? Do they really not vote for candidates that they know to be corrupt or perceived to be corrupt? In the last election in the Philippines, many of us thought that corruption remained an issue. But in my opinion, what happened in that election was unprecedented. It was, as you said, the level of frustration of people is so high that they just wanted to take down the establishment, quote unquote. So how are voters voting? How are they? What issues really drive them? Is it really corruption? Or is it their perception of security, of prosperity for their family? So I think this is cultural in the Philippines and maybe also for your other countries. So we should really ask those questions about corruption. But I agree with you that it really is a serious problem. And it's a vicious cycle because of vote buying. Because of patronage politics, corruption is a cycle in democratic countries. Also in non-democratic countries, corruption is there. So it doesn't, we're talking about corruption in democratic governments, but there's also corruption on the other side. So unless we stop, we break the patronage politics cycle. Corruption will always be there in our political society. So what to do? I'm always looking at the future. There's always hope in the future. I'm always looking at young people because if my generation, our generation, can't help it now, I'm still hoping that the next will, right? I mean, these babies, who knows, but are born this year, 20 years, 50 years from now, might achieve what we have not, at what we cannot. So the educational system has to respond to this. I think the educational system in my country, or in your countries, should really reform its way of teaching citizenship and the role of governments in our lives, in our daily lives, because we don't teach that in the grade school. I think that in the Philippines, we really should start talking about this, citizenship roles and politics as early as in the grade school, and gender equality as early as in the grade schools. And also the political parties have a lot to do with this problem of corruption because of their internal selection. They're left largely to themselves without rules, if there are no rules and laws that will are guidelines or prohibitions. The political parties in democratic states are free to do really what they like. And the idea is that the people will vote for whoever has the best programs, right, of political parties. That is if you have strong political parties. But in the Philippines, our political parties are not strong. Or, politicians change political parties every month, if you like. There's no prohibition from jumping from one party to another. And because we have a weak political party system, we cannot fix the problem of corruption and gender inequality. So it's not just a matter of laws, but also I think when the problem is that political parties don't, of course, naturally, they don't want to lose power, right? So they don't really want restrictions and a lot of prohibitions because that can make them lose power. But I think that, other sectors can demand performance, can demand better things to come from political parties. The media, the civil society, the academe, even the people in the streets, because now people, everybody, tricycle drivers, tuk-tuk drivers in the Philippines, they have internet in their phone, and they express themselves. But what kind of expression? I agree with you that it's a lot of frustration, what their government cannot deliver, that the MRT trains are not running on time, that the trains are broken again, These are everyday complaints of voters, of people, to their government. So we really have to accept that social media is very important also in the expression of rights and liberties. So we have to use it, to adapt to it as institutions, no? Coming from my point of view. And that question is really interesting. How is democracy doing vis-a-vis the opposition? And in the experience of the Philippines, this is all I have to say. Our people remained poor under a dictatorship. Many years. Our people remained poor under colonization by Spain, by America, and then when we had independence, of course I have to say the men were largely at fault in this because they dominated the government. Just an aside. But my experience is that Filipinos remained poor during a dictatorship. And I don't know if it's just the world market that has resulted to a better economy, but it's really also largely due to the policies, fiscal policies of our democratically elected government. Of course, there's corruption, but as a system of government, it has improved. A democratic government has largely improved the economic status and political status of Filipinos, which is why we have a very vibrant CSO, as you said, also like Indonesia. In the Philippines, you just mention one thing, they'll organize and people will be there in the streets. So I don't really know if the attraction of authoritarian states that are economically prosperous is just about money. Will people want a form of government that will just bring them prosperity, or do they also want to be to have a way of life where they can express their freedoms? For the Philippines, I think it's the latter. Because we already have experience in the past of a dictatorship, and we fought against it. So, and then we still have complaints. Of course, there will always be. There's no perfect government, but in the Philippines, I see it working in the way that people are able to express, not only through their means of communication, but also through their votes, that they don't like this government, so they want a new one. All right. So and then we have also what do you call this? We have to appreciate that that the people are free to express their ultimate choice in what kind of government they want and what kind of people they want. But I think that on the part of my institution, the COMELEC, it's not enough that we count the votes. Isn't it, Commissioner? It's not enough that we make sure the elections are credible. I think we also have to, we owe it to the people, personally this is my opinion, that we should be able to express or lay it out that these are the problems of political parties, because nobody will say that to them. In the Philippines, nobody will tell the political parties it's because you are weak, eh. It's because you don't give women an equal chance. It's because you don't list them. It's only the Commission on Elections can do that with some results. So I like the questions, and especially that question, how is democracy doing vis-a-vis the opposition? I think that's that's a take-home question for me.
Well, I agree with all the speakers, but in the context of Indonesia, there were 6 agenda of reformasi. I'm part of the reformasi generation. I was in the second year as a university student when reformasi happened, and I'm part of the reformasi. 6 agenda of reformasi are succession of national leaderships. We had it with the fall of Suharto. And then the amendment of the 1945 Constitution. We have 5 times amendments of our Constitution. The third one is the eradication of corruption, collusion, and nepotism. We established Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, a very powerful institution in Indonesia. The fourth agenda is abolition of the military dual functions. So there's no room for military to enter politics in Indonesia. The fifth agenda is enforcement of the rule of law, and the last one is the implementation of regional economy. We almost have all the agendas in place, except the consistent implementations. But as the illustration, a few days ago, the Speaker of Parliament, National Parliament in Indonesia, arrested by the KPK. More than hundreds regional heads and vice heads arrested by KPK. So it's part of our campaign slogan to public that this situation created because we have the democracy, because we have the reformasi. So if you are supporting the democracy, it means you are supporting anti-corruptions, anti-corruptions. So by having clean and good politicians and political party, it means you are strengthening the democracy. We work closely as an NGO with media and KPK to promote this idea. So by promoting anti-corruption doesn't mean that we are undermining democracy. It's in one package. Now we are working with the KPK to, we already started, to have a smart and integrity class for young politicians. We work in several provinces to promote smart and, we call it smart and integrity young politicians. We assist them how to do the good campaign, integrity campaigns, how to have clean campaign finance, and so on and so on. By having this connected and consolidated movement between civil society, media, and corruption commission, we hope that we can have better political parties in Indonesia. And Indonesia is a presidential system with presidentialism with multi-party system. There's almost no political party can have their power for the second terms. In 1999, we have PDIP. 2004, we have Golkar. 2009, Democrats Party. 2014, PDIP. So the voters of Indonesia is so, vibrant to respond to the political parties and the candidates. And I put those situations as a hope that the democracy in Indonesia will, resilient, and then can face the challenges, political identity, and then the rise of fake news, as long as there's a strong connection between the movement of civil society, media, and then the democratic institution.
Thanks very much for that. I have 2 questions already on the list. Could I have some more? A few others? 4, and 1 more, Saku. Mario, can I ask you to start, please?
Thank you. I'm Mario Gomez from Sri Lanka. I just wanted to ask the panel whether they had any reflections on countries that have gone through a sharp transition, like Sri Lanka, Nepal, maybe the Philippines in 1987, as against where there's been perhaps incremental political transition, like Indonesia, maybe South Korea, and maybe Colombia on the other side. Are countries that have gone through incremental and progressive transitions easier to manage politically? Because the expectation is less, it's easier for political elites to deliver on performance. Whereas when you have a sharp transition, like Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines again, there is enormous expectation which is very difficult to meet and therefore very difficult to manage. And so I'm just wondering whether you have any reflections and thoughts in terms of comparing those types of transitions and how you think these might be managed. The other question is on institution building after authoritarianism. Again, does the panel have any reflections on how do you recover the robustness, the independence, the credibility of institutions after a transition? And I'm particularly interested in the Indonesian experience because my understanding is that you've begun to be able to re-establish some robustness in your anti-corruption commission, your gender violence commission, your constitutional court. South Korea might be another example of where the constitutional court has begun to play a sort of fairly important role. And I'm just wondering again, how do you try to recover that institutional robustness? Is it dependent on personalities, or is there a larger process that you can entrench so that you ensure these institutions sustain beyond the life of those personalities?
Thank you, Mario.
Thank you. I have a question for three panelists except Philippines. Why Philippines is excluded? Because that's the only country I have not visited yet, so I understand it the least. First, Bhutan. I had the pleasure of visiting Bhutan when in its transition phase, and but I find it very almost disturbing that the country which used to talk of happiness very soon, within a few years, is now talking of corruption. You are such fast learners, that means politics and democracy actually brings in corruption and not happiness. Now that is a serious case study for me, and I would like your thoughts on that. But of course, since the topic for this session was 21st century challenges, corruption continues to be a continuing challenge. Indonesia, you made a very interesting point that Islam and democracy coexist, which is contrary to public perception. Although Islam is the most democratic religion, it is supposed to be totally egalitarian, but it is a paradox that democracy doesn't succeed in any Islamic country. They are more comfortable with the dictatorships, but you are an exception, and a beautiful exception. Another point which your country proves is that contrary to public perception that women in Islam are suppressed and they will play second or third class status. But in Indonesia, when I went there a couple of times, I find them equal participants. They're very, very comfortable with their gender. They're very comfortable with their religion. This is something which you may like to even write on as a woman and as a person who's working with democracy, as a case study for a lesson to other Muslim countries. And yesterday we heard on the TV, there are 57 of them, 57 Muslim countries. Then Sri Lanka. I was lucky to be an observer in 2015 January election. And one thing I've not been able to understand till date, that at that time, the election sees he was a one-man institution and he was a government department and he was a government official. How come a dictator of the kind you had allowed him the independence to conduct a very good and free and fair election? Even neutrally, the appointed commission sometimes are not as independent, and as he was able to do. Second thing which I don't understand, another unique thing is that President Sri Sena, who used to say that if he loses the election, he will be 6 feet under, surely he would have been killed. How he decided to carry on and keep on board the person who was out to finish him, and decided to work with him. Of course, this must have been a constraint because some of the reforms which he had promised have not come about. Because of this contradiction, the two opposite camps working together, I don't know what the experience is. Madam, although you have not invited me to your country, but you made a very interesting point, because the 21st century challenges which were being talked about, one was internal democracy, that is a carry forward from the previous century, corruption, gender. These are all ongoing issues. What are the new challenges for 21st century? And so you underlined social media indirectly, but I would like that to be highlighted by this group and some of us individually also, that is one challenge for this century we have to deal with because of its anonymity. We cannot regulate it, we cannot control it. There has been a lot of discussion, but no foolproof answers have yet come forward. Second 21st century challenge, now this is my addition to the discussion today, is anti-terrorism is proving to be counterproductive to democracy. The way in the name of nationalism, they're coming down on civil liberties, and that is very, very anti-democratic. And what are the safeguards that our countries have to take to ensure that this threat, the terror threat, is not abused against democracy? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. The gentleman at the back, please.
Niranjan Sahu from New Delhi. I have two questions to all the panel. One is about the closing space. All over the world, if you look at democracy, we are today seeing a situation in which like 30, 40 years of gain that was made by civil society movements. A lot of organizations that fought and won the democracy in many regions are today actually facing the pushback from the governments. This is, I'm talking because last year we did, in fact, a study with Carnegie on this closing space. And we found in many of the most progressive, in fact, democracies in Asia, including my own country, India, we have now increasing number of restrictions coming on, civil society organizations. There have been issues of, their regulation, funding. Media is also coming under a lot of sanctions and restrictions. You have independent institutions which are also facing attacks, and all kind of, restrictions also been imposed. So in a sense, the gains that we made for last several decades looks like, disappearing. And that would actually greatly damage the democratic fabric, especially as a check against authoritarian tendencies, what we are witnessing all over the world. So I would actually request all the panels to reflect how their country is actually, each country is dealing with those sort of situation. And then second issue is about the rising influence of plutocracy. Wealthy candidates, we talked about the money politics yesterday and corruption, how this linked. But if you look at democracy, most of the democracies today are actually coming under the clouds of, wealthy candidates, business men, controlling. In fact, in some of the cases in India, a couple of business houses are bankrolling entire election expenditure. So that actually is a very dangerous thing, because this will act as a quid pro quo, and they would actually, your governance, everything is compromised. Your actually entire delivery system in which this democracy has a strong foundations will come under great stress. So how these four countries are also tackling these issues of money, especially the plutocratic influence over the democratic politics? Thank you.
My name is Salim. I am from Bangladesh. I have two simple questions. One is to Philippines. You actually give us statistics about gender quota, gender representation, equal representation, something like that. But you have not, probably have not told about the gender quota in the election commission. There's been what percentage of women must be recruited as election commissioners? Is there any law, any legal framework, any regulations or any guidelines? My second question is to Bhutan. As Bhutan was a monarchy, and the democracy initiated by the king himself, not the citizen like Nepal or any other countries. So, and also Dr. Qureshi raised this issue. So my question is, what is the current mindset of the Bhutanese people about democracy?
Thank you. Sako?
Talked a lot about ethnicity and democracy, but today religious identity and fundamentalism, even though it is seen as a part of ethnic identity, it has got a kind of primacy of its own. And I'm not only talking about Islam, I'm talking about Buddhism, the Hindutva, rise of Christian fundamentalism. And it becomes much more difficult for democracies to argue in this context, because the idea of equality and people's sovereignty and popular democracy is sort of diluted when you have to talk about religious doctrine and the kind of privilege that religious leaders are beginning to have now in the political space, and just their presence in the democratic space shuts everybody else down. And how does one actually deal with that? Certainly in Sri Lanka, this is an issue, and I think it has become an issue in Pakistan, and even in Indonesia, it is a challenge that you're dealing with. You have a strong, vibrant democracy, but it is certainly facing these challenges, and people don't know. The secular institutions don't know how to respond to them.
Thank you, Saku. Just looking at the clock, I think it might be worthwhile. We might not have time for a third round. So could I just invite some further interventions and then give a last opportunity to the panelists for about 5 minutes each, please, to say both your final remarks as well as respond to as many of the issues that have been raised as well. Could I have a few more questions if there are any?
I thought I should make this comment because as I'm here listening to the talk, there seems to be this recurring theme of mistrust, trust deficit, and eventually we tend to be targeting, or rather pointing at politician not being able to be a trustworthy, institution, politics. So I was just wondering, rather than just targeting at just politician, are we also looking at other actors who contribute towards creating that trust deficit? A specific example is media. Pretty much, it depends on how media projects that politician or whatever, the issues that is being brought about. Are we also talking about the integrity of that media, whether it is, whatever media form it is, because this can really accentuate the problem, which may not necessarily be so much of a problem. And that actually have this larger spin-off effect on people who consume this media, news, and they think that is correct. But are we also then talking about the people, people who are reading this news? How much capacity do they have to vet out what is true, what is not? So are we looking at all these actors when we talk about addressing this mistrust or trust deficit? Thank you.
No further questions or observations? Good, very good. We can therefore give the panelists a little bit more time. Would you prefer to go this way?
The other way.
Oh, fine, that's absolutely fine with me. Titi, then we do start. Try and...
Thank you. We had the momentum in 1999. So all the situation supports us to have systematically to have reform in all aspects. In 1999, we can have anti-monopoly laws, we can have constitutional court law, we can have corruption eradication commission laws, and many others democratic laws. We have the situation, we have the momentum that maybe we cannot have it now. So the challenge is how we ensure that all the democratic institutions created since 1999 perform well. Well, the contribution of media in Indonesia and also the civil society helps to safeguarding the performance of this institution. The last survey of CSIS puts the political party and parliament in the lowest level of the trusted institution, democratic transit institution. It creates a big discourse in Indonesia, and some of the political leaders tries to solve this problem by inviting the civil society activists and then social and media activists to talk about the reform recommendations. So I can say that we still have the dialogue mechanism in Indonesia that must be used by the political parties, activists, civil society activists, and media activists to create a better situation in Indonesia. And about the Islam and democracy, there's no contradiction between Islam values and democracy. In Indonesia, democracy becomes part of the daily lives, our activities. The voter turnout in Indonesia is so high. In last local election, the voter turnout in average is 78%. So with the procedural of democracy, we don't have any problems. But the problem is with the elected officials resulted from elections. There's from our data now. This is part of the Indonesian challenge. Now the Indonesian economy is controlled only by the richest 20% of the populations. Oxfam mentions the total wealth of the 4 richest people in Indonesia, which amounted to 25 billion US dollars, equivalent to a combined wealth of the 100 million poorest people. So Oxfam also reported that despite the country's highest growth urbanization status in Asia, the inequality of urban population in Indonesia increased, as did the imbalance between rural and urban areas. This economic inequality is then used by the pro-status quo groups as a campaign instrument to influence voters to return to the authoritarian era. For example, if you come to Indonesia or check the social medias, there's a slogan from the Javanese language, "Better in my era," right? With the accompanied by big photos of Suharto. So economic issue is now used by the pro-status quo groups in Indonesia to backsliding democracy by using the economic gap slogans and so on and so on. So, but with the free media, vibrant civil society, and then the existing of the democratic institution, if we can create dialogues among those institutions, I believe that it can contribute to strengthen the democracy in Indonesia. And in Indonesia, one of the unique characteristic in Indonesia, we have so many big mass Islamic organizations. Let's say 2 biggest one, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. It's a Islamic organization, mass organization in Indonesia that actively building an interfaith dialogue among the religious leaders in Indonesia. So we have a continuous dialogues promoted by our religious leaders to deal with democratic issues, to deal with the identity politic issues. And this organization and its religious leaders actively involved in promoting tolerance, and anti-terrorism, and also identity politics. For instance, in Jakarta gubernatorial elections. And also, yes, there's a rise of, radicalism, yeah. In last survey in Indonesia, found out that 30% of Muslim in Indonesia prefer to live with their Muslim neighborhood. So they, they don't like to live with others religions, people around them. And it's one of the biggest challenge. And working with the religious leaders, reform religious leaders, and then progressive media, I think part of our solution to deal with this situation. Thank you.
Mark, I like that question because it became an issue in the last elections. The People Power Revolution in the Philippines ended the Marcos dictatorship in 1986. That's only about 30 years until 2016, the last election. But the 30 years, analysts say the frustration of the dissatisfaction of the people in the promises of the People Power Revolution, meaning democracy, was low. High, the dissatisfaction, and that it was not met by their elected leaders, And of course, we had the second Aquino for president, right? In '86, Cory Aquino. In 2010, her son, Noynoy Aquino. So that question of how to manage high expectations when you shift suddenly from authoritarian to democratic forms of government is really a very important question. I think that's really for future generations, and then for other countries, this is really a good area to study. I think that you can manage high expectations by ensuring credibility, as you said, integrity in institutions. What we did after 1986 was to have a new constitution, which put in place the constitutional commissions, including the election commission, the office of the ombudsman, which is the anti-graft court, then the anti-graft body, ombudsman, for investigation, then the anti-graft court was created. And then, so the Constitution really was the fundamental, right, expression of the people's, of the reform after 1986. And, what do you call this? What's very important, I think, is the independence of the judiciary in democratic institutions. Let's be preserved, because the other branches of government, the legislators, the Congress, the executive, these are powered by politicians. It's only the judiciary that is not composed of politicians in most of our countries. Of course, there are lawyers, academicians, judges who have been promoted. So it's very important that the judiciary responds to, as the last arbiter of sorts for the people. I think that the frustration, the results of the last election, you can see that there was a high level of frustration of the people, and why President Duterte won. It's because the majority of the voters believe that the other administrations have not delivered. And so we're looking at popularity, personal politics. And this is where social media also is important, because of the pervasive use of social media, and it's an individual connection, right? Anybody can publish anything, say anything, and it's out there. It generates a popularity-based choice instead of a program-based choice in voting. Especially in the Philippines, our political parties are not strong. Social media has really had a large effect on the voting behavior of our people. And now we are starting to find out, or there are reports that there are a lot of fake news using social media that pervades in our society every day, especially in our politics. The other question is gender in our institutions. I think the problem is that in our Constitution, sir, it says these are the constitutional commissions, right? Election, audit, civil service. But it doesn't say that at least half of them should be women. So it depends on the president who appoints and the Congress who confirms, right? So by track record, the Commission on Elections has had one woman commissioner in the last so many, maybe 4 rounds, no, of appointment. And that's why gender equality really is quite a recent focus for the Commission on Elections. 1 out of 17 regional election directors is a woman, only one. 22% of our provincial election supervisors only are women. So the Commission on Elections in the Philippines is managed largely by men, yes, but they get gender sensitivity quite well. In fact, nationwide, our regional directors are our gender and equality focal persons also. So that's very promising for the Philippines. But I wish that our constitution did say, just like in some of your constitutions, that, you know, so many women in these commissions. Money in politics remains a problem, even also in the Philippines. Also that we're starting to see now allegations, at the least, if not evidence, of local government officials having been elected, allegedly using drug money or supported by drug lords. So it's not at that level where it's, you know, it's supposed to, it can cause you panic and, you know, it's pervasive. No. 2 or 3 came out in the news, but we should be aware of this. We should be aware of what drug money can do to the politics of our country. And that should be stopped. And I don't know how our Anti-Money Laundering Act and institutions can detect, find out, and prosecute this election-related flow of illegal money in our elections. But we should work harder at it. So the same in the Philippines, as in other countries, that there are moneyed people and families dominating politics. Whereas before, I think, you know, like 40 years ago, 30 years ago, very rich people don't really join the fray. They don't join the elections. Now, they just fund, right? Many years ago. But now, they personally run. So you see a lot of our senators, oh, they're millionaires, billionaires, our congress people. So I think that's a common, that's a challenge, I think, in this century. How to democratize or level the playing field for candidates, you know, because only rich people are elected, you know. You look at your Congress. Well, I look at mine, and they're very rich people. And it's a good thing. They're all well, you know, I thought, well educated and all that. So how are we going to do this? Are we going to have very rich people in our Congress until what? The next century? So, and how do we solve that problem?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I owe my ability to recover partly my voice to many kind people who gave me ginger water and lozenges and everything else. Thank you so much indeed. And I didn't have to use the slides. I'm grateful to Dr. Qureshi for his very important questions. Bhutan used to be known as the last Shangri-La on earth till a few years ago. I have to say that that is not the case. It is not the last Shangri-La, but it has an image of the last Shangri-La. When I travel around, I often get asked this question. In Bhutan, you believe in gross national happiness. You are the cradle of, Bhutan is the cradle of the ideal of gross national happiness. So everybody in Bhutan must be very happy. and I have to explain to them that that is not the case. Bhutan is a real country on the face of this earth. The Bhutanese people are real flesh and blood people. We get sick, we get old, we are mortal. And we do, yes. And we have our own challenges. Today we are a part of the global community of nations. For a very long time, Bhutan remained under what is called self-chosen isolation. That was a difficult policy, but a very wise policy. It allowed us to do a lot of things. The first one being able to maintain its sovereignty. And secondly, also provided us an opportunity to evolve a unique culture and a worldview and an outlook and a development philosophy. So gross national happiness is something like our North Star. We believe that every nation ought to have a North Star. It's a metaphor for a large vision, a big message. We were talking about the lack of a big message yesterday. But nations and societies and people do need a big message to galvanize them, to look to a future that they are happy about, that they aspire for. So gross national happiness is a large vision of a good life. It is a large vision of a good society. We may not get to that reality in one generation, or in 2 generations, or in 3 generations, but we need a vision. We need a goal so that consciously and mindfully we direct our energies in the direction of that goal, so that we're at least mindful of the fact that here is a goal we must direct our energy towards. So that is how we understand gross national happiness. And to say that, that happiness and corruption are contradiction in terms, it is true. A happy country do not need to be corrupt. It doesn't need to be corrupt. Happy people do not need to be corrupt. However, we are a part of the global community. Mass media is here, mass advertising, social media, mainstream media. And as a part of this family of nations, as also a beneficiary of developments, innovations, inventions, enterprise in and around us, we are very likely to be influenced by what's happening around us. We have issues with our young peoples. We have issues with unemployment. However, these are issues that we believe we can deal with. But what is important is for a country to have a large vision, to have a big vision. We call it the North Star. So we have no challenges we have no illusion, We have no illusion about the challenges. We are not perfect. We have our difficulties. But we believe that if consciously and mindfully we head in the direction of our choice, the chances of that we'll make fewer mistakes. That's how we look at gross national happiness. And the second question was about how the Bhutanese people are coping with democracy. I think we're still very nostalgic. It's with a sense of nostalgia that we're dealing with democracy. Democracy is exciting. It has made a lot of things possible. Because the nature of democracy that is in a hurry all the time. See. Democracy is a rushed business. So it makes things happen quickly. It is both good as well as bad. Good in the sense that it expedites things, but bad because it doesn't take enough time to reflect on what are the larger issues involved, what is going to be in the long-term interest of the country and the society, see, and the people, the future. So at this point in time, we believe that the institution of monarchy that has made so many things possible for Bhutan will continue to remain as an important instrument, a symbol of our unity. The institution of monarchy will continue remaining an important symbol of our cohesion. It is the principle of cohesion, principle of national unity and harmony. Political parties and governments will come and go. But despite the vagaries of
politics and change, the institution of monarchy will provide a factor of constancy and stability as we look to the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, with regard to Mario's question about sharp transitions and incremental transitions, what I can observe, though, I think is this, is that in terms of preparing for the regime change or trying to effect the regime change, I think it's important that the program of reform that is going to be instituted in government is worked out beyond the broad brushstrokes. And I think what happens is that you have the broad brushstrokes almost platitudinous, which not worked out in terms of detail leads to a lot of disagreement and to a lot of paralysis once in government. And this would require, I think, where political parties are concerned, for them to be a lot more professional in the way that they deal with this question. It would also, I suspect, require a much better partnership between political parties and civil society institutions that work on these questions, because quite often the issue of what needs to be reformed is not something that is only discovered the day before yesterday kind of thing. It has been known for some time, and there has been work that has been done in terms of what the alternatives are, and political parties need to get in touch and bring themselves up to speed as far as that is concerned. Quite often they don't, and they of course do not necessarily have research institutions of their own which do this. With regard to the specific questions, Commissioner, with regard to Sri Lanka, absolutely right that in 2015 in that election, a lot was riding on the independence of the particular election commissioner, Mr. Deshapriya, and I think I'm very glad, therefore, that the first amendment that the government brought in, the constitutional amendment, the 19th amendment, brought in the independent commissions, where it wasn't any longer going to depend on a particular personality alone, because I think that would have been indeed quite unhealthy and also very risky. Yeah. The point with regard to you also asked the question of how does President Sirisena work with his predecessor? How does President Sirisena work with his predecessor after having said that he might well have been 6 feet under if he'd lost the election? I'm tempted to say to you that, that's a question I would like to ask him too. With regard to the question of the safeguards, what safeguards we should have in terms of, and the problem of anti-terrorism being in some way eroding. I mean, we had an example here in Sri Lanka. We lost the GSP Plus concession because of a number of things. And whilst we were in the process of, the government was trying to fulfill, I suppose, an election promise made with regard to a rather draconian Anti-Terrorism Prevention of Terrorism Act, had come up with a version of a Counter-Terrorism Act. And there were sections of that Counter-Terrorism Act which sections of civil society and the human rights community found to be even worse than the existing Prevention of Terrorism Act. So there was a lot of lobbying and, in fact, action through the judiciary too, which ensured that that particular version was withdrawn, and so it's gone back to the drafting. At the end of the day, I suppose what it does require in terms of this whole question of anti-terrorism and the safeguards and how it will corrode democracy is to ensure absolutely that you have an active, vibrant civil society that is able to intervene, that has the strength, the boldness, and the independence to be able to intervene and be vigilant with regard to this kind of thing happening, whether by error or by design. The point about closing spaces, indeed, it is interesting, that question, because this city has now become the flavor of the times as far as South Asia is concerned. Everyone is coming to Colombo, from Amnesty International to any number of organizations one can care to name, because there is the belief that the regime change of 2015 has opened up spaces, ironically at a time at which in the city there is concern that the spaces might be slowly closing up. But there again, I think it goes back to this whole point. There is absolutely no substitute, and it sounds platitudinous and clichetic to say this, but there is no substitute in a functional democracy for civil society, citizen vigilance in terms of checking and balancing the exercise of governmental power. I think Montesquieu said this many hundred years ago. It still holds true, quite simply. In this country, we waited 25 years to get a regime change in 2015 on an agenda that we basically defined and defended in the most inhospitable circumstances over 2.5 to 3 decades. But it happened. Lots of drawbacks too, but it did happen and it took a long time. So the resilience of democracy also ultimately depends on the resilience of its liberal civil society to hold true to its convictions and beliefs.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That's an excellent note on which to end this panel. Thank you very much for all your rich interventions and questions, and I hope you will now join me in recording our appreciation to our 4 excellent panelists. Thank you very much.
Part of the program, which is the presentations from the discussions that we had yesterday. In case you weren't here, you can see some of the topics that were discussed on the screen now, and looking forward to some really interesting and engaging presentations starting now.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm Yashin from Malaysia. Our question was, how can the democracy assistant community engage civil society to resist authoritarian tendency from elected leaders? So we basically look at, we have quite a diverse countries, composition of Bhutan, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and also Fiji, and India as well, many others. Yeah, so this is like the result of our discussion. So basically, we identified challenges and then we propose solutions to those challenges. We look at how what are challenges faced by different political actors. So the first one, we were looking at political parties. So the challenges that we found were firstly with dysfunction of major political parties. So political parties are often self-seeking, and this kind of leads to a distrust towards political parties. And then we also discuss about the paradoxes of democracy, where people want democracy, but there is a distrust towards politicians. And then the third point that we were talking about was lack of ideology within political parties. So ideology can be changed from one day to another, and there's no consistency in terms of ideology and what they are proposing. So all this distrust towards political parties leads to an indifference among voters, especially the younger generation and those in urban areas. So voters felt that there's no need to vote because of distrust of politicians. So the other political actors that we look at was the democratic institutions. So political actors such as government attacking legitimacy of democratic and independent institution. So we were also discussing on the notion of impunity, where this is a particular concern in the context of contemporary authoritarianism, where the elected government get away with impunity. So then we look at the civil society, how moral activists are moving into the political sphere, where they face the challenge of maintaining autonomy, where sometimes they are taking political positions and supporting government sub-agenda. So civil society sometimes are not democratic themselves, in the example of many times they ask that governments declare their assets, but civil society themselves do not do so. So that's the lack of transparency in that sense. And then lastly, we look at media. So two aspects, the mainstream media and also the social media. So mainstream media, many times they are paid opinions and paid news, where and sometimes the media is owned by political parties. So that kind of, the question is, can media be really independent and also survive the market system? That was the question that we were discussing as well. And during the campaign, many media are paid to publish news that are biased towards a certain political parties. So as for the social media, I think was discussed that there's a dissemination of fake news and whether the accountability, and then there's no way to certify and control. So that's the problem of regulation of information on the social media as well. So I pass to my colleague to talk about the solutions that we proposed.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Anna from the Philippines. In our afternoon session, it was a very lively discussion. A number of solutions were proposed by the varied participants from different countries. And at the end of the day, we deemed it fit to classify all the proposed solutions to 3 standards. And we are all familiar with these standards. And we categorized the solutions into these 3 standards because some of the solutions were crisscrossing amongst the stakeholders. So there's one solution which is applicable to a political party, to the media, for example. So we just had standards to our proposed solutions. And the first standard that we want to propose for the solution is transparency. This is with regard to political parties and candidates. Some of the participants in our group wanted their candidates to have a declaration of assets, candidates and their families, and they also want to have the NGOs to have a declaration of their assets. So this relates to transparency on how rich candidates are, on how rich the NGOs are. Another solution as to the standard of transparency is that the appointment should be bipartisan, meaning the appointment should come not only from one party or one group, it should come from all of the groups for the institution or government constitutional agency to be well represented and not only coming from one party. The last solution for transparency, which we had in the Philippines, just to share, is the reporting of campaign expenses for the parties and the candidates. As to inclusiveness, this solution also relates to the declaration of assets. People should be, the forms to be accomplished by these political parties and candidates should be simple enough so that people could understand these forms, so that people can take part or partake in the analysis whether or not their candidates, their politicians, or their political parties are getting rich while in business or while in politics. Another solution that we propose for inclusiveness is for funding for state parties, to come from not only the government but also from the private sector. So there was a discussion on funding to be given by companies to these political parties, to these candidates. Another one on the standard of inclusiveness is to have public education, to teach our people the functions of the different government agencies, the functions of the different politicians, the different government officials. Another aspect of public education is to teach people, to teach the public on how to engage with their government. Because in the Philippines, for example, not a lot of people know how to engage with their government. They always just go to Twitter and complain about the traffic, but not really relating it to a specific agency. So we want to teach the people, these are the government agencies and these are their functions. So that if you have a complaint about traffic, then you go to the traffic department and not go to the legal department. So that's part of the public education that we're proposing. Last one is on accountability, and this also relates to political parties, their expenses. We want to have a post-election monitoring of promises made by the candidates and their political parties, so that these candidates would be held accountable for whatever they promise, for whatever they said to the people while they're campaigning to be elected in office. Another aspect of accountability is relating to the media. As what my colleague said earlier, one of the problems of the media right now is on legitimacy, their integrity. And one of the solutions that we propose as a group is for the media to self-police itself, for a media NGO to be the governing agency or group to police their fellow media outlets or fellow media entities. Because if the government would be the one policing the media, then we have an issue of the freedom of expression. Another solution as to accountability is for the candidates to be graded or to have a mark sheet or a scorecard based on their performance. So in every election, before every election, these scorecards or these mark sheets can be given to the people, to the voting public, so that they would know whether or not to vote for a candidate or a certain party. As the last solution, there was a proposal against cross-ownership of media outlets. For example, the owner of a newspaper outlet can't own a TV news agency. So there's a proposal on the prohibition of cross-ownership. And the last one is there's a recognition from our group that social media really plays a role in our elections and in the state of democracy. So one of the overarching solution that we propose is for the CSOs or the NGOs to have their capacity increased or strengthened on the use of social media and their work as to their advocacies. So that's the end of our group's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I ask the people from Lab 3, I think, the one on money, influence, and corruption, to make their presentation?
Okay, thank you very much. We're from Lab 2, which looks at Chapter 5 of the International Idea publication, actually, entitled Money, Influence, Corruption, and Capture. Can Democracy Be Protected? So we're looking at protection. And we had a great and diverse collection of minds in our group. There was a member of parliament, 2 current and former high-level civil servant, 5 PhDs, 2 election commission leaders, 4 civil society activists, 3 international assistance providers, 2 university professors, 6 researchers, and last but not least, 3 lawyers. And we all came from 9 countries. Yeah, and you're looking at one now. All right, so we're looking at how we can protect democracy from these money influences, and there's a question that's already chosen for us, which is how can oversight mechanisms be enacted in order to combat corruption? So the key words are oversight mechanisms, and this is where we started thinking how and what can be done to improve oversight mechanisms in order to protect democracy. So there were, out of a long list, because of these great minds, we came up with 3 main ideas. The first one is to keep forums like this going, where a sharing of experiences and views and thoughts can be continued, and with the participation of various people from various backgrounds, from political parties, civil society, election management bodies, etc. And then what's not surprising, lack of political will is often the barrier, and we thought about how this can be overcome. And the idea was to look at more towards how civil society and political parties can work together in overcoming political will, lack of political will. So the first idea is about candidate charter, where the candidates sign up to wanting or allowing their information, their biographical information to be announced, their asset declarations to be published, and following a certain code of conduct. And then on the citizen side, citizen journalism should be encouraged to publicize these candidate charters. And after the elections, a charter commission be established to follow up and monitor the implementation of the charters. And then the third idea is how can we take advantage of technology in forwarding a better oversight mechanism. So the group is thinking about developing a database for increasing the transparency of politicians and political parties, and therefore improve access to stakeholders in terms of monitoring, and also in just simply knowing what are the financial capacities of the various political parties and politicians. So we unpacked each idea. So starting with idea number 1, where we articulate further what the problem is. So on the first one, which the idea was the forum, there's inadequate regulatory frameworks amongst many countries due to poor legislative design towards political finance systems. And not only that, the enforcement and compliance have been weak. There's lack of integration between enforcement bodies, meaning lack of coordination perhaps between election management bodies and financial authorities, anti-corruption commission. And also there's lack of integration between those enforcement bodies with civil society. So what needs to be done about it is, at the regional level, there needs to be a learning and sharing platform to help improve these regulatory frameworks, and also through publications that some of us are already doing. What are the risks to these ideas and objectives? First is we need to avoid the danger of crude transplantation of solutions, meaning you take one thing from one country and plant it to another. We all believe that each country has its own context. So what these countries need to do is to understand comparatively what's happening in other countries and see how it can be applicable, rather than take it point blank and put it implemented in their own countries. Then secondly, there's inadequate commitment from the participants of the forum. So this is where a facilitator, a driver, sometimes a catalyst is needed to take things forward. And then lack of follow through in terms of the outcomes. Now, this is why after a forum like this, for example, there needs to be continuous communication, continuous engagement, so that the outputs can continue to go with the momentum in terms of making things, improving things in the various countries. And then back to the second idea, which is about addressing lack of political will. The problem here is there's not only lack of political will, but possibly a lack of capacity in the part of stakeholders who play a watchdog role. So there isn't enough counterbalance and pressure from the other side to try and turn the political will onto the positive side. So what needs to be done about it? So again, the angle is about getting candidates, political parties as allies, as allies to the watchdogs, and working together with civil society in providing oversight, better oversight, and pressuring politicians to improve and comply to the various political finance regulations. The risk, of course, is that in some countries, unfortunately, there could be a personal risk towards the individuals that are actively advocating. And this is where the many is stronger than one comes in, that these people needs to be supported by the community. And then lack of institutional uptake. This is where the lack of political will lies. And this is where we need to find champions, especially among the younger generation of politicians in leading the charge. Of course, sustainability is also a risk factor. But with strong alliances and strong interests within civil society and others, this initiative can hopefully continue moving forward. Okay, lastly, the third idea is about technology, and in this case, about developing a database for improving transparency. The problem here is that the information might be there, but they're available in hard copies. There might be some legislative impediment as well in making them available. So how about bringing about technology that can help overcome all that? So the objectives are, of course, strengthening access through availability on website, on other methods. My time is saying I've run out of time. And then empowering citizens, especially at grassroots level, to actively access the data when it's already there. There's no point in having data when it's not used by anybody. And all these transparency and data availability will hopefully enable a level playing field for potential candidates, for political candidates, in terms of getting the election finance information out there, in terms of fundraising and sharing of information. So the risks are that the database security might be weak, so make sure that there's a robust security system linked to it. And when we talk about technology, it can be expensive and yet inadequate. So make sure that there's enough planning and then finding the most affordable solution. All right, I think that's it, and I hope I did justice to the group on this. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lina Antara from International IDEA. We discussed inclusive peace building in conflict-affected states. And since our participants were coming from 10 different countries, including Myanmar, the Philippines, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Fiji, Vietnam, Timor-Leste, we try to draw on the national perspectives, but we try to discuss from a regional approach. So we identified commonalities, challenges, and solutions that could be adapted on a case-by-case basis. And since peace building and conflict is very contextual, and it always depends very much on the national and the local context, we decided that our project would identify one overarching challenge, which is the challenge of limited political participation of marginalized groups in decision-making and in politics from a broader perspective, which means that when we talk about limited political participation, we include both participation in formal politics and formal decision-making, such as electoral processes, political parties, or parliaments, but also informal or community level initiatives. And then we identified more specific challenges that can affect and can restrict the participation of marginalized groups. One of those is the ethnic and religious divisions. And the second one was the risk of violent extremism and polarization, the limited understanding of electoral systems, and here some of the participants highlighted that there is often limited involvement of marginalized groups in the design of the constitution and in the design of the legal frameworks or the electoral system, and then hence the limited understanding. One of the factors is the lack of involvement or the lack of consultation, and one of the challenges, even when there is consultation, is that it's often done in a tokenistic way. So marginalized groups may be included in consultations, but in the end, their views are not really heard or are not taken into account when the final decisions are made by the dominant majorities. Another challenge that we identified are the high illiteracy levels that are persisting in certain countries in the region, and the limited access to electricity or infrastructure that we can limit the access to information or the access to different like the access to the polls, for example, or the access to different processes that determine the outcome of post-conflict transition. And I believe that was mentioned also in the morning panel. We discussed the role of the military after following the transition, and the transition of the involvement of former combatants in political parties. So one of the challenges is that people who participated in the conflict and who played a key role in the conflict, to which extent are they going to be subjected to transitional justice, or are they going to be involved in egalitarian terms in any transitional democratic process? The final challenge has to do with the fact that constitutional and electoral reforms are oftentimes not inclusive, and when the marginalized groups are included in consultation committees, this may not always be genuine or comprehensive. The outcome, the overarching impact that we want our project to have is enhanced, genuine, and effective. To have an enhanced, genuine, and effective inclusion of marginalized groups in the constitutional and electoral reform. And how are we going to achieve this? The solutions that we proposed involve increased capacity and understanding, so through capacity building and skills building initiatives targeting specific marginalized groups, to increase the accessibility to the polls, and this specifically refers to people with disabilities as one of our target groups. Then we propose a series of consultations and advocacy activities and events involving different segments of the population, depending always on the country context. Systematic and targeted voter education and civic education activities tailored to the needs of each particular group. A comprehensive assessment, an informed and comprehensive assessment of the push and pull factors. And finally, the involvement to find creative ways and constructive ways to involve the military in peace dialogues in a way that can enhance the accountability and transparency of the military. On our implementation plan, we decided and we agreed that the implementation should follow the framework of human rights and accountability and the rule of law. And the implementation of our project should also adhere to the international standards and the international treaties that have been signed by each state where the project will be implemented. And third, that we should aim for homegrown solutions. This means that local or domestic organizations should be implementing the project with the support of international and regional organizations, but it's very important to have local ownership of the project outcomes. Then specific activities and means to achieve our outputs and outcome can involve campaigns through social media, to target specific segments of the population, like the youth, who are more and more using social media for their communication. To use the radio in order to reach out to populations that have no access to electricity or have no access to television or other means of information. To use visual tools to reach out to the population who have lower levels of literacy. And finally, to use friendly language, youth-friendly language, or the language of the minority, which can be sometimes can be different from the language that the mainstream media is using. Finally, we identified some risks. One of the risks that was also mentioned this morning by Dr. Sara, as far as I recall, is the issue of sequencing. The issue of sequencing between different events, such as the signature of peace accords or the peace dialogues, the conduct of post-conflict elections, the reform of the electoral framework, or the reform of constitution. So all these events may sometimes happen in parallel. It can be disturbing or disrupting the peace-building process. And we also talked about the risk of transitional justice and the dilemma of involving former combatants into the peace-building process, or vetting people who can enter into politics after the transition on the basis of them having committed a crime during the period of the conflict. Last but not least, the target groups. I think they merit to be mentioned here. The target groups are, of course, specific to the different countries and to the local context. But the ones that we have identified are women, youth, ethnic and religious minorities, people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, migrant workers, and internally displaced people, IDPs. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Could we now have Professor Peter de Souza from the Center for the Study of Developing Societies to make some concluding remarks?
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by congratulating International IDEA, CPA and Democracy Reporting International for organizing this event and for being involved in the launch of the report. It's always a pleasure to be here at occasions such as this, because one gets a chance to draw on ideas that are expressed from right across the region and learn from them. In fact, when one encounters these ideas, one sees that these ideas are expressed at least three levels, all of which need to be integrated. The big thematic level of what is happening to the democracy landscape in the 21st century, the specific rubrics level, which is the chapters in the volume, and the specifics, as you've just heard, in terms of what should the responses be. I want to speak about the question of resilience, but before I do that, I want to step back a bit and remind all of us of two very important aspects of this report. The first goes back to the State of Democracy framework, which is International IDEA's unique contribution to the democracy debate. I say this because I was involved in its first deliberations in 1997, but I'm not offering that date as trumpeting my association. But I want those of us who are working on democracy to be reminded of the fact that when International IDEA began its deliberations on trying to create a state of democracy framework, they had two very clear objectives in mind. The first was to ensure that the framework was not going to be prescriptive. In that sense, it would be different from other frameworks that were available globally. But that didn't mean that it was not going to be normative. It was not going to be prescriptive, but it was still going to engage with the key ethical principles that democracy represents. The second goal of those early deliberations was to speak to the diversity of democratic experiences across the world. So not to speak from a northern viewpoint to a southern viewpoint, or to always sort of speak down to other democratic experiences, but to, in a sense, include the different practices and experiences across the world as if they were part of the framework. And with that in mind, and after several days of deliberation in 1997, led by, and I must record my appreciation of that, David Beetham, the State of Democracy framework came about. Now, I take you down this memory lane because I want us all to return to thinking about that framework, because two very important principles, when people ask you what is democracy, and all of us sort of stammer a reply, because it's such a difficult thing to define. And yet, in 1997, two core principles were identified, which meets the diversity criteria and which meets the normative criteria. The idea of popular control and the idea of political equality. And if you look at the framework, from popular control came the attributes that were then listed in the framework: accountability, responsibility, effectiveness, participation, etc. So you have core principles, you have the attributes of those core principles, and from those core principles come a set of institutions which, in a sense, encompasses the diversity. So you can have a presidential form, you can have a parliamentary form, you can have a range of institutions. So core principles, attributes, institutions, and there's a whole diversity. That means one attribute can produce many institutions, and then you have outcomes. So I begin by reminding us of that, because I think what is very important for all of us who are in the democracy landscape or the democracy community is to recognize that we have available to us one of the most fascinating intellectual frames to accommodate our experiences, to be able to which is available to us to meet both the high normative arguments and the specific institutional recommendations that we want to make. And often new practitioners tend to lose out on that huge resource which International IDEA created. The second thing I want to mention before I begin my discussions on resilience is to talk about the production of this report. What you have is a finished document, which you can appreciate in its entirety. But to reach that finished document was a very, very, a process with a lot of contestation. I was associated with it as a marginal player, being a member of the external advisory board or editorial board. So I joined the deliberations in a somewhat hostile way, because I wanted the South to be represented. I wanted our politics to be there in the report. And I was not sure whether this global report would do that, because quite often global reports speak from certain viewpoints and certain locations. So I began challenging every formulation. Every chapter that came to me had 2 pages of comments. And I must say that after several months of this process, I've become a champion of the report. And only through this continuous process of deliberation and feedback. And what did the report go through? First of all, there was a lot of debate on the selection of theme. What should the report be? We want to do a flagship report. What should the first thematic be? Because it's the first report after 20 years. And the idea of resilience came up. There was a lot of debate of alternative themes. The second was the process of feedback. And remember, feedback is coming from all regions of the world: Latin America, Asia Pacific, Europe, North America, from practitioners, from chapter writers. The third was the format of the report, because we wanted to have a lot of illustrations, and we wanted to make sure that those illustrations didn't only come from the global south, but also came from the global north. We used the methodology of tables, the methodology of boxes, the methodology of incorporating illustrations in the main text. And as a result, we have the first report, which is a hugely valuable document as a resource for democracy practitioners across the world. But not only is it a resource in terms of illustrations, so that all of us, whenever we want to win an argument or develop an argument or reference an argument, you have a very important report available to us. And that report has been organized around 5 to 7 rubrics, and I hope that now that it becomes available in the public domain, it will generate the kind of global debate that we want it to have, and I think that the 3 organizing institutions would certainly encourage it to have. So having made these sort of initial background comments, let me add to our concerns. So far we've got challenges that democracy faces, and I want to add to these challenges somewhat big picture thematics, right? So I don't want to go into just things like corruption, etc., but I want to, in a sense, at least invite you to look at 4 or 5 big questions to which we really need to bring our collective intellectual scrutiny. The first is the rise of what is now commonly referred to as as populism and the populist leader. I would prefer to use a more academic category to describe this phenomenon, and the category that I would rely on is the plebiscitary leader. Now, right across democracies, and even non-democracies, but let me just stay with democracies, leaders are emerging who are, in that classical definition, plebiscitary leaders. A plebiscitary leader is one who is able to speak to the electorate, to the citizens, over the heads of institutions, who's able to connect with the citizens through building up a relationship of devotion, building up a relationship, an affective relationship, through which the citizens begin to believe that the leader will deliver. The plebiscitary leader, in a sense, constitutes a daily plebiscite with the followers. And plebiscitary leaders are emerging in democratic spaces. You look at the Philippines, you look at India, you look at Turkey, you look at the United States, you look at France. So it's across the world, we are beginning to get a class of leaders emerging who are connecting directly with the electorate. And that's a worrying point. And they're able to connect directly, and this is where we need our collective intellectual scrutiny. They're able to connect directly to the electorate through modern media, through the technologies of the digital world. So Mr. Trump has 44 million Twitter followers, and therefore he's able to take on the mainstream media through this constituency that has been built up. And this is true of all the plebiscitary leaders across the world. They have created a relationship with their followers, harnessing the technologies of modern media, of the digital world, to build constituencies that are loyal to them. And those constituencies are difficult to break, because the constituency is living in a world which is very fluid, is living in a world which is very uncertain. And they need certainty in a world of uncertainty. And the plebiscitary leader provides that certainty. The plebiscitary leader says, I will solve the problem. So we will drain the swamp in Washington. We will restore national pride in Turkey. We will get rid of drugs, the drug smugglers, which is the main problem in the Philippines. So the plebiscitary leader creates a constituency of citizens who believe in him, and it will take time for this constituency to become skeptical of the capacity of the plebiscitary leader, because of the harnessing of these digital technologies to produce a body of loyalty. So that's the first issue I would like us to think about. The second is the tension between two processes which are very much a part of the democratic landscape. The processes of global capitalism on the one side and the processes of democracy on the other. Now, capitalism is not about equality. Capitalism, in however sophisticated form, is about the production of inequality. It has to reward people at the top and take from people at the bottom. Therefore, over the history of capitalism, states have always tried to remedy these effects through welfarist strategies, through a whole policy package which tries to take from the top and give to the bottom. But the capacity of states to do that has declined, and declined intellectually. That's the point I want to make. It's not just because of globalization, but today the dominant discourse is that the only way forward for a state to develop is to join the global capitalist order, and therefore allow finance capital, allow global consultancies, allow ratings agencies, allow law firms to determine national policies. So capitalism is producing inequality, democracy is producing equality. And you have therefore a classic tension between these two processes. We need to think about how these two tensions can be reconciled, if they can be reconciled. And I think a lot of our suggestions are in a sense trying to deal with this, the emerging contradiction between the political equality of democracy and the economic inequality of capitalism. And it's interesting that even the World Bank, the UN, are all producing reports on inequality. Inequality has now become the major concern. The third global trend that I think we need to worry about is the tension between nationalism on the one side and cosmopolitanism on the other. Democracies generally tend to be cosmopolitan. We are inclusive. We want to bring in people from minority groups who are culturally different from us, etc. But what we are beginning to find is, because of the plebiscitary leader, we are beginning to find the use of the nationalist card, of the cultural nationalist card, in the mobilization of populations. You see this very effectively in Turkey. You see this in India, perhaps in the other countries. So this tension between nationalism and cosmopolitanism is a tension that is being played out in our democratic landscape. You see this in Myanmar as well. Now, all these are resulting in a weakening of institutions. And this came up in our discussions over the last 2 days, because the plebiscitary leader is now challenging the legitimacy of institutions, so that you challenge the courts, you challenge the police, you challenge the head of independent constitutional bodies, because you want to replace them. You want to have pliable institutions. And the final point is, this challenge is resulting, and this is very serious. This is so surreptitious that we don't notice it. You challenge the liberal discourse that has been the mainstay of democratic thinking since the end of the Second World War. Today, the whole argument about rights, human rights, equality is all being undermined by a kind of nationalist, plebiscitary discourse. So, you get the worst kind of hate politics beginning to emerge. You get the idea that people have rights and they must be protected is now being challenged by a counter discourse, which is growing because of these other phenomena. So in such a world, I think our report becomes extremely important. I think the report, because it flags 6 or 7 rubrics, and at the end of each chapter, it gives you a set of recommendations which we can think about. And I think, therefore, it must almost be the sort of first reference point whenever we hit a crossroad. Now, several issues came up over the discussions over the last 2 days. And we need to, let me just flag some of them, because I think while many of them are specific, they can be grouped together in terms of specific issues. I think the first big issue that all of us have to think about is the emergence of the digital world. I won't just talk of social media, but the emergence of the digital world. And the digital world has central to it two faces. The digital world is Janus-faced. On the one side, it's very enabling. It allows communication. It allows huge advantages to people across the world. So it's very enabling. But on the other hand, it's very disruptive. So the digital world has both an enabling quality and a disruptive quality. And we see that most in social media. So social media can produce the citizen journalist, but social media can also produce fake news. So we need to think about what the digital world is doing to the democratic landscape. That has been said by several of you, and I'm only adding to that. I mean, I realize the power of the digital world. I must sort of tell a story of how some weeks ago I was in Indonesia, and I went to this very remote island off the coast of Flores, which is called the Komodo Island. And I must tell you that in Komodo Island, the 4G network was working. So everybody in remote parts of the country were all on their mobile phones communicating. The second, I think, so if we have to think about the digital world, the second thing we have to think about is the tension between these 2 points that came up again in the presentations and in the panel discussion. On the one side, the erosion of legitimacy and trust. I think this is a big concern. But do not discount the fact that on the other side, democracy has become a common sense. I mean, you go anywhere in India and people want to resolve disputes by democracy. Let's vote on it. You go to a playing field, you go to a school, you go to a movie theater, and if people are dissatisfied, they say, "Oh, this government will not work." You know, democracy has become a common sense. It's not just confined to seminar rooms and conferences. It's become part of people's sense of their rights, of the way forward when they hit conflict situations. So when we are, I mean, while it is true that from the late 1980s, there has been a concern with what is called disaffected democracies. And this concern with disaffected democracies emerges from a realization that young people can go to other sites to solve their problems. They don't have to go to politics. They can go to culture. They can go to economy. So there was a whole book called The Disaffected Democracies. On the other side, democracy has become the main game in town. It is the place at which you go to solve your. So we have to think about both these phases. Let's not only look at the negative side. Let's also look at the fact that when democracy becomes a common sense. In India, for example, if you ask people, what does democracy mean to you? If you ask this question in the West, scholars will say democracy is about government formation, but it is not about justice, it's not about rights, it's not about development, because justice is a big concept equivalent to democracy. So don't overload democracy. Don't overload democracy with justice, with rights, with development. Treat them as analytically separate ideas. But in India, if you ask people, what does democracy mean to you? They will say it is justice, it is rights, it is development, it is dignity, it is that. And if you say take these concepts out of democracy, then what kind of democracy is this? Democracy is all about respect and rights and development. So, therefore, it's important for us to recognize that we need, therefore, to strengthen this democracy game. And I think many of the suggestions that have come up is about that. Now, the suggestions have come up at two levels. One is institutional reform, and the second is what can broadly be called citizen education, normative learning, normative discourse. I would prefer to speak on the first. The second is much harder, and most civil society organizations are doing that anyway. Citizen learning, citizen education, normative discourse, placing things on the agenda. That's important, and that must be done. But to me, the real challenge is to look at institutions. The real challenge is to look at institutions, and in that sense, there's the Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom's work I deeply appreciate. And she makes a very simple point. She says, look for small changes in institutions, because small changes sometimes produce large outcomes. So therefore, as a community of practitioners, let us agree on one small thing. Let us first of all identify the points of infirmity. Let's call them the points of infirmity in the configuration of institutions of our democratic institutions in our own societies. Let us look for those infirmity points, and then let us look at how we can address those infirmity points through small changes. So, for example, as you say, women's representation. That's an infirmity point. There aren't enough women. So one way to address it, like in India, the women's movement was able to do, was in 1993 to ensure that the local level of government, 1/3 of seats was reserved for women, right? And 1/3 of the heads of the local government were reserved for women. As a result, in some states of the Indian Union, more than 50% are now women. A change has taken place. Look at the question of representation. Subaltern groups in India, Dalits, backward castes, in the normal course of things would never have a chance to get a say in government. So we then have a quota policy. And that quota policy is now where politics is being played out. Infirmity of representation, the institutional solution would be a quota policy. And the power of the quota policy is, whereas it was intended to produce representation, it has now actually also produced secularism. So not only has it given these groups access to the formal structure of politics, but having entered along a certain path, they cannot be mobilized along a communal path. So it's given us secularism as an unintended consequence. So look for infirmity points, and let us therefore, I think when I hear what Philippines is doing, what Indonesia is doing, what Bhutan is doing, what Bangladesh is doing, I can see fantastic innovations that are available. So maybe I can urge the three organizations to actually work towards building a directory of institutional innovations, Just ask, it's so simple, ask all your friends in the civil society group to send 5 important innovations that are being tried out. For example, I think the Sri Lankan Amendment 19 is is it 19 or 17? 19 is a hugely powerful institutional innovation, because it through one small device like that, you are able to break patronage politics, at least to combat patronage politics, because all high constitutional office now has to be done through this bipartisan body, which will determine who's the head of the UGC, who's the head of the Human Rights Commission, who's the head of the Accountability Commission, or the Comptroller and Auditor General, or whatever those bodies are, the high bodies. Now, a small device like this begins to, and it's not that people are going to do it because they are enlightened. They're going to select these people. They'll do it just because through a political calculus. If it's a bipartisan body and you have a candidate who's loyal to you and they have a candidate who's loyal to them, you'll choose a third candidate who's not so loyal to either of you. This is my understanding of the logic of strategizing. And therefore an initiative like that, in Bangladesh you had the caretaker government. I don't know if it's a good idea, but Bangladesh, the movement from one government to the other was always associated with a lot of challenge and a lot of challenging the legitimacy of the result. Was the caretaker government a good idea? That during the period of election, a bipartisan body would be created that would handle, because succession is always a big challenge in all our democracies. So how do you deal with the succession legitimacy problem? Media, for example. We are all very worried that media has become partisan and been bought over. So one is the suggestion of enacting laws to ensure no cross-holding. Another idea has come up that let's argue for an independent media body. So it's not government controlled, it's not industry controlled. Let's try and argue for an independent body where industry is forced to contribute through some kind of an annual contribution, whose members are perhaps nominated by the Amendment 19 kind of body, but which then acts as a regulatory body for both mainstream media, electronic media, and maybe even social media. Is the Federal Communications Commission in the United States something like that? Let's look for such solutions. Let's look for small institutional innovations that target institutional infirmities that we have. Let's look at, for example, the idea of submission of assets by civil society organizations. Now, I think if International IDEA, CPA, Democracy Reporting International, and other such bodies that have been working to deepen and strengthen and broaden democracy can offer a platform for people to send in their recommendations on as to how to take forward the institutional architecture of our democracy so that they become more robust, so that they are more resilient to the attacks that they will face. I think we will have more resilient democracies. So with that, with those sort of very hurried remarks, I'd like to again thank the three organizations for giving me this platform to address you. I could go on and on because I've been with International IDEA for 20 years, but because, like you, I too have sort of invested deeply and greatly in thinking about democracy, and I'm certainly no agnostic when it comes down to the benefits of democracy, as it is the best game in town, and let's work very hard to protect and develop it. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks. The organizers would actually like a group photograph to be taken now, so if you could ask all the participants to come up.